The United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York. What are the big issues making headlines? Hello, I'm Arland Naidu, and this is The Heat. Leaders from around the world are continuing to address the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi was one of the first speakers on Wednesday. He said he wants commitments from the United States if there is to be another Iran nuclear deal. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, also addressed the Assembly. He blasted Russia over the conflict in Ukraine, and he outlined U.S. policy towards China.
Let me be direct about the competition between the United States and China. As we manage shifting geopolitical trends, the United States will conduct itself as a reasonable leader. We do not seek conflict. We do not seek a Cold War. We seek to uphold peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. We remain committed to our One China policy, which has helped prevent conflict for 4 decades.
Later in the show, we will have a one-on-one interview with the UN Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. But we begin with the latest developments at the UNGA. Joining us here in Washington, D.C. is Anton Fedyashin. He is a Russian expert and a professor of history at American University. Also joining the discussion from Beijing is Anna Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Tahe Institute. Thanks to both of you for joining us. And Anna, let me start with you. We just heard from President Biden there. He says he is not seeking a Cold War with China, and the United States remains committed to the One China policy. That's despite what he said a few days ago about Taiwan. What do you make of what he had to say?
Well, it's a lot of talk. I mean, if you go through his speech, he talks about all the issues. He says he's not trying to make people choose. He says he supports all these issues. But if you look at his actions, there's a paltry sum put towards a fraction of what they put towards the war in Ukraine, which is being offered for climate change, the food aid, etc. So I mean, it's just a talk shop. He's out there to portray U.S. as strong. When he says that we're going to be a reasonable leader, I think there's going to be a lot of bristling within the UN itself, because the U.S. has not been a reasonable leader. It's not taken the forefront of the fight against the pandemic. Even you had he was blasted by the African representative from Kenya because he said this is exclusionary nationalism. So I think it's just words at this juncture. And until people get a real sense that the U.S. is committed, I think they're just going to say this is business as usual. Say one thing, say another thing. No one really knows what your intention is. Strategic confusion seems to be the order of the day.
And Anna, what do you make of the inconsistent foreign policy statements coming from the United States president? As I mentioned, his statements over Taiwan. He says something one day, and a few days later he says something very different, and then his aides have to scramble to pull back what he said, to correct what he said.
Yeah, strategic confusion. It used to be ambiguity. Now no one has any idea. It's really the worst possible thing that you could be doing at a time when there's so much uncertainty in the world, is adding more to it by conflicting statements. It's really difficult to tell who was worse, whether it was Donald Trump or Joe Biden, because you have no idea what either one of them is going to do.
Anton Fedyashin, President Biden also was very tough on Russia in his address to the UN General Assembly, and he underlined the importance of the rights of sovereign nations. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
The United States wants this war to end on just terms, on terms we all signed up for, that you cannot seize a nation's territory by force, that the only country standing in the way of that is Russia.
So there we heard it, Anton. There was an American president saying you cannot seize a foreign country by force. I mean, what do you make of this tough talk and the claim that Russia is trying to erase a sovereign nation off the map?
Well, first of all, the one thing that the United States has been consistent about is certainly its position on Ukraine. I heard Einar a second ago, but this is, and there's plenty of inconsistency, but this is clearly a consistent position. This is nothing new. This is part of the Western interpretation of what the Ukrainian conflict is about. I'm sure that many of the delegates from the global south, especially from the Middle East, would have probably sort of smiled or grinned to hear the American president talking about respect for international law and international sovereignty. But on the other hand, of course, with this catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine, this is a rallying cry to the West yet again, just at a time when the weapons supplies to Ukraine are beginning to dwindle. And now that the Russians have decided to trigger a partial mobilization, this is, of course, exactly what the Ukrainians will want to hear.
Anton, you mentioned that call by President Putin of Russia. He ordered a mobilization of reservists. He also made what some people may regard as a veiled threat about the use of nuclear weapons. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I would like to remind you that our country also has various weapons of destruction, and in certain aspects, even more modern than NATO countries. If there's a threat of territorial integrity of our country, in order to protect Russia and our people, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal. This is not a bluff.
So, Anton, this announcement by the president calling for a mobilization, how is that being received in Russia? And what do you make of the possibility that nuclear weapons could end up being used in this conflict?
So, Anand, it's a bit too early to tell exactly how the Russian population will react. So it's only been a day since this has happened. We know that there have been demonstrations. We know that several hundred demonstrators have been detained in different cities in Russia. Fewer so far than there had been demonstrators against the war when it was, or the military action, when it was declared back in February. The question is, how is the bulk of the Russian population going to react? There was a scramble for tickets and airports today to fly out of Russia. This is, again, something we saw in February and early March. We'll see how that goes. I suspect that the bulk of the Russian population will actually stick with this because remember that when the Russians pulled their troops out of Kherson, the most vocal critics of that decision actually came not from the peace party, but from the war party, in the sense that it's time for Putin to abandon the delusion of the special military operation and actually treat it as a war, which of course it's been from the very beginning. So we'll see over the next few days how the Russian population will react. As for the nuclear threat, again, this is nothing new. We've heard these reminders, and this is why Putin said, "Let me remind you." We've heard this before, that if Russian territory and the foundation, the stability of the Russian state are threatened, this is actually written in the nuclear doctrine of Russia, then the Russians will resort to nuclear weapons. I think that the chances of that at this point are fairly low. But then again, as I've said so many times, war is such a contingent and unpredictable phenomenon that it's impossible to predict from day to day what's going to happen.
I know China has also been talking about the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman issued a statement today in which he said that China wants a ceasefire through dialogue and consultation to address what he said are the legitimate security concerns of all parties. So China would like to see an end to the violence, to the confrontation, but at the same time is saying that, look, it's both sides that have security concerns in this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the irony here, I mean, it's astounding that Joe Biden would talk about territorial integrity. I mean, the hypocrisy of it is unbelievable. And I think more than a smile, I think there's a very sad smile by the countries that have been affected by this. But going to this issue, it's very simple. If there is a buffer zone created around Russia, whether the countries themselves are part of NATO doesn't matter. The issue is Russia does not want missiles on its borders, nor does it want soldiers. So at this juncture, if there's going to be peace anytime soon or in the future, it's going to depend on the territorial and also security of both entities.
Anton, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the General Assembly was also heard from the Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi. He talked about Western concerns over nuclear weapons development that they say is what Iran is doing. Let's listen to what a bit of the Iranian president had to say.
The Islamic Republic of Iran is not after building nuclear weapons, and such weapons have no place in our defense doctrine.
So what is your assessment of what he had to say, Anton?
Well, I think the question is, what is the assessment in Washington and Israel? And I think it's going to be skepticism. The tragedy of this situation, Anand, is that the United States, Russia, the EU, spent months on meticulous, very serious, highly professional, and highly respectful, by the way, negotiations to reach the comprehensive agreement. And then, unfortunately, Donald Trump decided to back out of it. And here we are, back to square one, talking about the nuclear program in Iran, with the Iranians assuring that they are not pursuing one, Washington and Israel, among others, being very skeptical. It really is a tragedy that political decisions by world leaders can have such important repercussions. I think it's now up to the Europeans, the Russians, to try to bring the Americans back on board. I haven't seen any particular desire within the Biden administration here in Washington, D.C., to really go back into this full force, because they're so distracted by all of the other crises in the world.
And Anton, one of the other things that President Raisi wanted is he wants an assurance from the United States that it's not going to sign an agreement this year, or perhaps during the term of President Biden, and then have the next president, whomever that is, violate that agreement, withdraw from that agreement, as President Trump did with the first nuclear agreement. I mean, does that call into question U.S. credibility and U.S. respect for international law?
Well, it certainly calls in the U.S.'s commitment to its to the papers it signs, and I'm afraid, look, the Iranians have every right to demand this. Unfortunately, one of the problems of democracy, which is otherwise a perfectly good political system for all of its problems, one of the problems is that one elected leader is not beholden to what another one promises or even signs. Mikhail Gorbachev, who has just recently died, was on the receiving end of just such verbal promises from Western leaders about NATO expansion, unfortunately, and then lived to witness 6 of them. So I don't think that any American president, even if he did sign such a commitment, would ever be able to lock his successors into it.
Aina, what are your thoughts on what the Iranian president had to say at the UN? I mean, they've been talking about resuscitating the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA as it's called, for some time right now. And there's been, recently we've heard, there's been some optimistic noises we've heard that it could be back on track.
Yeah, well, everyone hopes so, but the issue is there's no trust anymore. The United States has violated treaties after treaty. China is looking at this in terms of what the U.S. is doing with the 3 communiques, which is the basis of U.S.-China relations. They're pushing things on Taiwan. Iran has the right to say, look, you walked away from this deal. How can we make sure that you don't do it again? And unfortunately, the answer is you can't. There used to be this idea that precedent, if you're, somebody before you made an agreement, you would honor it. Donald Trump has thrown that out the window. I mean, he walked away from the Paris Climate Accord. He walked away from the from the Iranian nuclear deal. But it's not the first time, and he's not the first one to walk away. Kyoto, the other climate change conference, the U.S. walked away from its agreement there. So right now, the U.S. is in a position where no one really trusts it. And that is an absolute impediment to having any kind of international order. So when the U.S. says, look, we're interested in international order and furthering all these goals, you have to start by, talking the talk and walking the line. And so far, no one believes that the U.S. is doing it. I mean, Russia is reacting to a situation where the U.S. and Europe is pouring weapons in that are killing Russian troops. And, it just seems endless. Billions upon billions, tens of billions of dollars are doing this. How long will you expect the Russians to accept that, people are arming their enemies? Generally, that's an act of war.
Anton, very quickly, I've only got about 40 seconds. President Raisi also slammed Western nations for the sanctions that they've been imposing on Iran. Now, that's something that will resonate with Russia right now, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. It would also resonate with a lot of other countries in the region and the global south, especially those that have been on the receiving end of limited American sanctions. So unfortunately, the General Assembly this year is going to produce a lot of fireworks, but I don't expect anything constructive to come out of it.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Anton Fadiyoshin, Anna Tangen, thanks to both of you for being with us. Next, we turn to the role of UN peacekeeping forces across the globe, including the contribution by Chinese personnel. My colleague Elaine Reyes talked earlier with Jean-Pierre Lacroix of France, who is the UN's Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations. Let's listen.
Most of the UN peacekeeping missions are on the African continent. The mission in Mali is soon entering its 10th year and considered one of the most dangerous. Many peacekeepers have lost their lives in recent months and in the years prior. You visited Mali recently to visit the troops. So can you describe the current situation there and what are some of the ongoing challenges that still exist in Mali?
Well, the situation in Mali and indeed the situation in Sahel is very worrying because we're seeing a security situation that is deteriorating, and as a result of that, the population is suffering, and we're seeing more displaced person and a humanitarian situation which is already dire being made even more serious because of that. Now, we are actually doing everything to mitigate the impact on the civilian population, to carry out our mandate of protection of civilians. And at the same time, we are determined to continue supporting the political efforts, because ultimately in Mali, the solution will have to be political, and it has to go. There are various routes. One of them is the implementation of the so-called Algiers Agreement, which we are actively supporting and for which there has been recently a number of meetings. The other one is bringing about or implementing the political transition, for which there has been an agreement on the timetable. So we are determined to do all this. I was in Mali recently for talks with the Malian authorities, as well as, of course, our colleagues from MINUSMA and the population. By the way, the population is in the areas where we are deployed, where MINUSMA is deployed, is very supportive of what we do. And I think it's comforting because we are also affected by disinformation regarding what the mission does. And sometimes it's a very negative disinformation. So we basically want to look ahead. We are in the process of conducting a review of the mission in Mali. We want to work with the Malian authorities so that we can define common objectives. And we want to make sure that as we will be working with the Malian authorities, we will be able also to make recommendations for which our member states, and particularly the Security Council, will be comfortable. So our agenda is really to support Mali, to support the efforts towards bringing peace and reducing this level of violence, and also taking forward the political processes.
Some of the UN troops in Mali include more than 400 Chinese soldiers. China, as we know, is a major contributor to the UN's peacekeeping effort, especially in Africa. So how key is China's role when it comes to the numbers dispatched and the role that they play on the ground?
The Chinese peacekeepers are playing a very important role. We have them in many of our operations. Mali is one of them, but also many other peacekeeping operations in Africa and beyond Africa, also in the Middle East. But China is also a major financial contributor and a country that supports us, of course, in the Security Council. But beyond that, we're getting support from China to our efforts to improve the effectiveness and impact of peacekeeping. And we consider this as very important because we are challenged from the point of view of the political and security environment in which we operate. You referred to the number of fatalities that unfortunately is still too high. And the efforts that we're making, they have one of the priorities of these efforts is actually to make sure that as we will be more effective, our peacekeepers will also be safer. And I'm mentioning this in particular since China took the lead in supporting the efforts that we're carrying out regarding the theme of the safety and security of our peacekeepers, which is critically important.
You mentioned China taking the lead. China is also delivering on its promise to have a standby peacekeeping force of 8,000 if and when needed. How do you see China's role growing in these efforts in the years ahead? And what do you hope to see there?
Yes, we are currently deploying units from China in a number of missions. Actually, one of them is the mission that we have in Abyei, which is this disputed area between Sudan and South Sudan, where we have deployed Chinese helicopters. And we are also working to deploy a unit of unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, or UAS to be more specific, in Mali from China, which are going to be critically important for the purpose of improving the situational awareness of the mission. So there's a lot that we're doing with China, and I'm quite sure that we will be doing more because there are opportunities that emerge on a regular basis because we're constantly adapting our peacekeeping operations because we want them to have the capacities that are adequate to the needs and to the situation on the ground, and that creates opportunities for new deployment. And we're very happy to count on the availability of China to support us.
The United Nations has 17 sustainable development goals to reach by the year 2030. That's coming up before we know it. Number 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. What is your assessment of where you stand right now and what more needs to happen to be able to reach that goal by 2030?
Well, building a strong institution is absolutely critical to us because we are deployed in most cases in contexts where the state capacities are weak, and therefore creating the conditions for our own operations to gradually withdraw, but withdraw in conditions where basically we leave behind us an improved situation from the point of view of security and development implies that we contribute to building strong national capacity, particularly in the area of security and rule of law. I think that we need to do more on this. Our peacekeeping missions are doing their part, but their ability to respond to the needs that are quite important in terms of national state capacities are limited. So we need to build capacities together with partners. And this is where the importance of partnership is also extremely relevant for the purpose of building strong state institutions, which is one of our top priorities. We need to work with all partners, regional, sub-regional organizations, but also important and influent member states who can help us in those efforts. And here again, I believe that China has a very important role to play in these efforts of building strong national institutions.
It's been a couple of years since many of these leaders have gotten together. We had a pandemic break. What do you hope is the key message and the big takeaway as everyone comes together this week?
Well, we certainly need to have a strong multilateralism. And the reason is very simple to understand. Also, the putting it into practice is more difficult. The challenges that we're facing are essentially calling for a multilateral response. If you talk about climate change, if you talk about terrorism, if you talk about pandemics, if you talk about the illegal exploitation of natural resources, and many other challenges, these are global challenges. And therefore, global challenges have to be addressed by the international community as a whole. There is not a single country that can address these issues successfully, without entering into partnership with others. And I think that's the key message. We have an international community which should be more united. I think the theme of the unity, the awareness that all these key global challenges require a strong, united response from our membership is absolutely a key when it comes to, I believe, the challenges ahead. And certainly we hope, and I hope that these will be very much in the mind of the leaders that will gather here in New York this week.
Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you making the time for us today.
Again, that was my colleague Elaine Reyes talking with the UN's head of peacekeeping operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. We will have more interviews and news coverage from the UN General Assembly throughout the week. Thanks for joining us on this edition of The Heat.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can